What made you choose this particular subject about this particular community?
Well, I mean, this is the community I'm born and raised in, so it was something that I'd kind of begun to notice. I'd noticed that there were neighbors and there were loved ones, family and friends who were moving away, and I noticed that people began to move in, whether it be in the form of realty, whether it be in the form of new storefronts, whether it be new residents, that traditionally would never have imagined being above 96th Street, which was kind of like an unspoken border in New York. And so I kind of wanted to know why, because even though East Harlem has been through a lot, and there are a lot of connotations people have about the neighborhood, throughout all the struggles that it's had, there's always been a tremendous sense of community, that even when the neighborhood was going through its worst times, you still had people out there looking out for you, be it someone who's looking out the window, be it a small business owner still holding on.
Yeah, that you're old school, looking out the window. Yeah.
No, and that's how it is. And so I started to wonder, why were those things going, and now why were businesses and residents moving in that would never have otherwise considered it? And I was curious, that's kind of what began it for me. It was less so much that, and I think sometimes people confuse gentrification when they talk about it. I think that a lot of people feel as though it's this wanting to cling to the past. And I think as I researched more, I mean, yes, there's a culture here that should be prized. There's a history here that should be told. But there's also a people here that should remain. Right. And it's the people aspect of it that really, really got me. These are lives that are getting pushed, and they don't have a ton of control over it. They think they have less control over it than they do. And so, Nelson in the clip, he says, this is a cancer, and once it starts, you can't stop it. And I didn't feel that way. And race is definitely a factor. I think that one of the things I like to say is, the color is now green. Because if you are moving out of these neighborhoods, they don't ask you what your color is. They ask, can you pay $2,200? Can you pay $2,400? Right. And if you can't, you leave. It just so happens that the majority of the people being pushed out are people of color in communities like this. So that's what makes it tricky, because redlining was something that was so very racial that now, as you have the reverse of white flight, and you have all this money now coming into the city and a lot of this development going unchecked, a lot of the same victims are the ones who were victims of redlining and ghetto packing back in the 50s and the 60s. I mean, the fact that you would have, that's the thing, New York had, not that it didn't have racial problems, but there were integrated or semi-integrated neighborhoods in the city. Granted, you might have had, if you cross this block, you get beat up by Germans, cross this block, you get beat up by Italians, as Judge Edwin Torres spoke about in his interview. But you did have a whole bunch of different cultures living in these neighborhoods, and one of the things that really began to ghettoize New York was what you said, redlining. You'll have any investment that in a neighborhood with over 5% people of color is deemed risky. I mean, that kind of incentivizes people to get out. People getting out of a racial reason. But then also from a small business reason, if you can't expand your small business, why would you stay? Right. If you can't make capital improvements to your apartment, why do you stay? And so I think that, now the same victims are the ones who were left, the ones who tried to make do and were able to make communities out of what the city had left them. Now you see them getting pushed out because now all of a sudden what they have is valuable. So race is an element. It's not the primary element, but it's certainly there. And I think that's what just makes this so difficult to deal with. Gentrification happens in waves. It's not just one event. I think when we think about gentrification, unfortunately, sometimes we think of it as the city coming in, knocking down someone's building, or a private developer coming in, knocking down someone's building, grandma gets pushed out, new condo goes up, and that this happens in a short amount of time. And if it doesn't, we almost kind of question if it's even happening. And gentrification, as Nelson alludes to, takes like 30 years. I mean, it is a long process. Now it changes depending on where you are. Williamsburg happened rapidly, around 10 years. That area, at least, that gentrified really strongly. Lower East Side took about 20 years up to around Avenue D. and even NYCHA's going to build luxury condos
I think
there.
that was because there was so much political resistance in the Lower East Side. There was a squatters movement, and they took over buildings, and they
were breaking windows. They were not having it. The Lower East Side, very clearly. I mean, we don't talk a lot. Some of the history we don't talk about. The Lower East Side was not about that at all, and they really made that very clear.
I know.
But anyway, so that's to say that East Harlem, now, this is taking, people thought this was going to happen in the 80s. They thought it was maybe going to happen in the 90s and early 2000s. And we're still kind of in this middle ground that the subprime mortgage crisis kind of actually slowed down, oddly enough, in this neighborhood. But small business owners who are coming in, they can, or residents that are coming in, they can afford to pay more than grandma, but eventually someone's going to be able to pay more than them. I never went to film school. I was lucky enough that in my last year at All Hallows High School in the South Bronx on 164 and Walton, they just happened to have a TV studio in the basement. They just happened to have a TV studio with like a couple cameras and a light that probably is just useless. It's not like the studio lights here. I mean, it was just like a floodlight. But I mean, but it was cool, because we just had that. We had iMovie, very basic tools. But I'd never held a camera before. I never actually, in that capacity, and I'd never imagined doing anything with film. And so I got just some basic instruction on, how to do a short doc, how to do a short narrative, and from there it piqued my interest. And since then I've been, working on getting better and trying to tell stories through film because originally I wanted to be a lawyer. And my parents are upset that I don't want to be one now, but I told them, look, the only type of lawyer I'd be would be someone who's either keeping people out of jail who can't afford it or putting bad guys in jail. And both of those have crazy caseloads and don't get paid or respected nearly enough. So I figured,
you the broke-hated variety of lawyer.
So I'm like, you know what, if I'm going to be broke, let me at least start doing something that I care about now. And I figured that this film was something that I could do now, that I had spent all this time studying and researching this and physically living it. And that this story is not just about this community, it's reflective of the change in New York, reflective of the change in the entire country, reflective in the change in many global cities throughout the world. So I figured at least this is something I could do now, tell the story of the residents here, and what they're going through. I did a lot of writing, I still do, but I think that I would attribute a lot of it to kind of how my parents raised me in terms of not so much how I created media, but more so how I consumed media. They were, since I was a young child, always forcing me to read good writing and forcing me to read bad writing too, so that I could understand why it was bad. But they would ask me not just to understand why something had been written there. Like, not just like what it was, but why, not just why, but who wrote it, not just who, but who allowed them to write it, and then for what publication, and then why is that publication interested, and who, kind of that, saying who benefits. I'm born and raised here. And I think that if anything, my work can at times maybe seem a little out of the ordinary simply because there isn't a lot of it that's allowed to be promoted. The same way Juan Gonzalez or David Gonzalez, their type of work, be for the Times or the Daily News, might just seem like so out of the norm. It's because it's not actually. So like, the type of storytelling I do, to me, all I was doing, I wasn't doing anything special. I'm just trying to let the neighborhood tell their stories. And I'm trying to step back and allow that process to happen. But so often in media, we're told how we're supposed to feel about a certain group of people and told how we're supposed to feel about a certain issue. And there isn't a lot of dialogue, especially when we're talking about something like, how we're going to, for instance, revitalize NYCHA, or how we're going to revitalize neighborhoods that have been systematically abandoned. There isn't really a diversity in dialogue in terms of what different solutions we can bring to the table. And so, I think it's just, I just tried to do what I could to listen to the community and let their voices be heard. This way people can one day cite this. And cite this and say, okay, this is not what Andrew thought. This is not what, this person from the neighborhood. No, this is an objective tale of what's actually happening in this community. I think that, the premiere that we had having so many people and having such a diverse cross-section of the community and other communities there, and then having such a robust conversation with Charlie Rangel, of all people, getting up and yelling at the crowd, which was random and interesting. Yeah, because he was in the film.
Right.
So he was there, and then, you know, people were getting up, and then he started talking around. He was like, how many of you vote? Like, just like getting into it with them. But I mean, like, that sort of dialogue, be it with one's elected officials, be it with one's community members, on the issue of gentrification, in that big a forum, happens very rarely. So it starts with that. It starts with education and empowerment, and then there's a whole bunch of solution people that we bring to these panels, and we'll continue to do so after the film, so we can talk about not only how we feel, not only how we're being affected, but what it is that we can do to move forward. And so I think that it's a long-term process. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's got to start with the conversation. We can't be honest about, we can't fix the problem if we're not honest about what it is. What I try to tell people is you have to be true to your own story. You can't try to tell someone else's, because no one can tell it better than them. And I think that there are, when you talk about systemic issues of race, when we're talking about in media, it's not so much, I mean, I'm sure there are some people who, you know, for racial reasons, be like, I don't like that story because I don't like these people. Maybe that's there, but I think that a lot of it is also the same way that, you know, if we come on up, we're, you know, you might bring people who are, it's a default to bring people who come from your experience.
Right.
You know, default to bring people who are in your friends circle. You know, it takes a lot of wisdom to be someone who's going to be like, I'm intentionally going to bring people who are completely not from my experience in, and I'm not only going to take a risk on them, but take a risk that they might have an even better story to tell than I do. You know, that's a huge risk that not everyone takes. And so I think that that's one of the systemic problems that's there, that, you know, you're not going to see a lot of Latinos in media until you see a lot of Latino gatekeepers in media.
Right.
You know, you're not going to see the same way you're not going to see a diversity in roles until the people who are actually up there or who are running their own media corporations that become so large. When those people in those executive positions are people with similar experiences, then they'll look for people who can reflect that. The same, you know.
Are we more afraid of risk than
the media is very afraid of risk. I think that's, I don't know, in terms of, as you said, the white media.
Is this a game for people who are afraid to go all in, though?
I don't know. I think that in terms of...
I mean, I turn on HBO, they got monsters coming out of people's, you know, women.
I mean, they have weird stuff there, but they're also, they're targeting that to a demographic that likes that. I don't think, for instance, HBO Girls, you know, some people might look at that show and say, that's a ridiculous show. It only talks about this small 1% of the millennial experience, a very, you know, monolithic 1% experience of millennials. But if that's your target demographic, that and people who aspire to one day move to New York and experience that life, well, then they're not taking a risk. So much as they have a target demographic, they'd be like, this demographic's going to watch, we're going to target it here. So I'm not sure... You know, I don't think that people are very, I mean, if you're looking at Hollywood, Hollywood's not risky. How many Fast and Furious have we seen? 6? We're on number 6. You know, we have movies like Three Musketeers, we have movies like G.I. Joe, just because people know the name and, you know, you could easily replicate it. They're not telling stories from our neighborhoods because they think that they might not be universal. But they're going to things that they can save money on promoting or they can get buzz with easier, and I don't think those are decisions of risk. They figure we're in a bad economy and this is a proven model and we're going to hit it till it hurts. But eventually I think the well dries up, and I think that that's going to be where an opening will come up for people from this community and ones like it to create media that is truly different, to create media that is true to their stories. So what I said, don't try to tell their stories, tell your story, because no one can tell your story better. And when it's time to tell your story, none of them will be able to do it like you. All I want to say is just thank you for the opportunity. It's been great being here. I'm really excited to be at the People's Film Festival. And if you want to find out more about El Barrio Tours, just log on, just Google El Barrio Tours. It'll be your first result. Go on to Twitter, El Barrio Tours, and there you'll be able to find information on screenings and dialogues happening throughout the city. The hope is to take this film all throughout the city to neighborhoods that are experiencing this, or just any neighborhood in general that wants to have this conversation, because if you're not experiencing it yet, you might, or you did. And then the hope is to really take this throughout the country. I've had people in Toronto, in Georgia, on the West Coast, in Canada, you know, reach out and say, you know, we want to talk about this issue. It's happening here. And so there's a desire here. We just need to actually make it happen. And so if there are any people that want to organize screenings, even if it's in your basement, I'm down to do it. It's about the conversation. It's about moving towards action. So.
Excellent.